You know, with everything that's been going on around the world, I think 2020 is actually shaping up to be a pretty exciting year for photographers with all these new cameras that's been coming out, like the 1DX Mark III, X100V, and the X-T4, which I'm testing in a couple weeks, by the way, so stay tuned if you want to see that. And with the imminent launch of the Canon R5 and the R6, which are probably the most anticipated cameras right now, I hear Sony is also preparing for their A7IV and the A7S III launch. So that made me think, well, given everything that we already know about the R5 and the R6, what would it take someone like me to actually finally ditch Canon and switch over to Sony? You know, when I tested the A7 III last year, you know, the A7 III is already a very capable camera, obviously, and some of the very few complaints about the camera that I had were more on the usability side of things, not on things like image quality or video specs. I mean, if they do upgrade the sensor and the video specs, I think that would be a good bonus. But I think they're gonna have to anyway this time around, because now that it has to compete with other cameras like the R6 and even the X-T4. But the image quality was already amazing, and me being more of a stills guy than a video guy, I had no complaints about the video specs, and those things are more secondary to me. I think the biggest complaint that I had about the camera, which may or may not be so surprising to a lot of people, was the grip. And I thought I'd get used to it after a while, but I just could not get comfortable with it. And which is a shame, because I really like the camera, but the grip isn't something that can be fixed with a firmware update. And I think I figured out why the grip was so uncomfortable to me, because as I demonstrated in my review, they have made the grip a lot bigger to house the bigger battery, but now because of that, the grip is so much closer to some of the lenses. And as you can see, this is a tiny lens. This is just an 85 1.8, and still my finger gets stuck in there, and this actually hurts when I grip the camera like this. And Sony obviously realized this issue when they first designed this camera, but instead of making the whole camera bigger, they just decided to solve this issue by shaving off as much material as possible from this inner area of the grip. And because of that, now that the shape of the grip is like this wedge shape, and it kind of slants out at about a 45-degree angle. So when I grip the camera, it just never feels quite secure, and I like to use the camera without a strap, and it just always slides off of my fingers, so like I always have to grip it so tightly to keep it securely in my hands. And if you compare that to my Canon EOS R, as you can see, the grip kind of shoots out more at a perpendicular angle from the body, and that also gives me more than enough clearance from my hand to the lens. And this is a pretty big lens. This is 15 to 35 f2.8, and when you compare the two cameras, the EOS R is really no more than like a quarter of an inch wider. And Sony did improve the grip on the A9 II and the A7R4, and I assume they're going to use the same body design on the A7 IV, unless Sony decides to surprise us with something even better, which I don't think they will. But even having that same body design will be a huge improvement, and not just with the grip, but also with the improved dials and buttons as well. And I think it's about time that finally Sony puts two UHS 2 card slots on the A7 line camera bodies. And again, if they use the same A7R4's body design on the A7 IV, it should have two UHS 2 card slots, but who knows, maybe they'll pull a Canon on us and give us one UHS 1 slot again. But with cameras like the A7 III, one of the reasons why someone would choose this over cameras like the A7R Mark III or IV is speed. You have a camera that can shoot 10 frames per second with amazing autofocus, but the writing speed always has been very frustrating because I like to use both of my card slots. The A7R4 does have a faster processor, but because the file size also increased dramatically, it didn't really make a huge difference. But if you put a faster processor with two UHS 2 card slots on a 24 megapixel camera body, I think this will be a much nicer camera to use. And some of you did ask me, why don't you just get an A9 II then? Well, the A9 II is obviously a great camera, but to be honest, for what I do, it's a bit of an overkill. And you know, and I don't know about you, but when I'm out shooting on the streets or when I'm traveling, I don't always want to be walking around with a $4,000 camera. I would much rather have two A7 IIIs, and that's another reason why I don't get cameras like Leica's. I mean, obviously everyone's different, but faster processor and card slots, I don't think anybody would say no to that. So do we already know what the A7 IV is going to be then? The same 24 megapixel camera with the A7R4's body? Well, like I said, the image quality was already good and I'll be perfectly happy with the same sensor, but the thing is, now that the A7R4 has 61 megapixels instead of 42, the gap there is pretty significant. Not everyone wants or needs 61 megapixel, 120 megabyte RAW files, but for the next step down to be 24, it could be a turnoff to some people, and maybe 30 or even 36 megapixels might be a good sweet spot nowadays. Or if they keep the same sensor and somehow increase the dynamic range or low light performance even more, that could also be interesting. But then I'm also curious how Sony is gonna separate the A7 IV from the A7S III, because the problem they had with the A7 III was because the A7 III's performance was so good, there was really no reason for anybody to get the A7S II anymore. So this is just a total speculation based on no evidence whatsoever, but maybe they'll bring the A7S III back down to like 12 megapixels or even lower and really make that a video camera that no one else can touch, and then the A7 IV can live comfortably where A7 III is now, or maybe the A7S III will be around 18 to 24 megapixels and then the A7 IV will get a bump in the resolution. Who knows, but either way would be pretty exciting. And another thing that's been pretty controversial in the camera world is the rear screen. And Sony just released the ZV-1 or the ZV-1, depending on where you're from, its first ever camera with the side flipping screen. Will either the A7 IV or the A7S III have a screen like that? And will I prefer that? I'm not so sure. I think a lot of people might agree with me on this, and please feel free to leave a comment if you don't. But normally for shooting photos, I usually prefer a screen like this, like on the A7 III, the one that flips up or down on the back of the camera. And for shooting videos, I usually prefer a screen like this, like on the EOS R, the one that flips out to the side. This is obviously helpful when I'm shooting videos like this so I can see myself, or when I'm shooting with a gimbal, I like having a screen that flips out to the side so it doesn't get blocked by the gimbal. And also when I'm shooting product shots or stuff like that with my hands, I can stand on the side of the camera instead of having to be directly behind it all the time. So when Fuji went from this type of screen to this screen on the X-T4 recently, I had mixed feelings about it, because obviously the X-T3 is a great video camera, but I never really considered it as a video camera personally, because the X-T3 is a really fun camera to shoot with if you like the physical dials and stuff like that, but they're not all that useful for video shooters. And although the video specs are amazing, the video autofocus was never quite at the same level as Sony's and Canon's, especially tracking faces for videos like this, although it's been getting better and better. But that's just me. Maybe overall there's a bigger number of people who prefer the X-T4 screen rather than the X-T3 screen, and maybe a lot of Sony users secretly prefer this as well. But with Sony, there's a different problem, because as some of you may have seen on some of the ZV-1 reviews, Sony for some reason still cannot make a proper touchscreen to save their life. And touchscreen is obviously useful, and even more useful on a camera like this, because when I'm shooting videos, I can see myself and I can change the camera settings on the screen instead of having to touch the buttons on the back. So by some miracle, even if Sony decides to put this screen on the A7 IV, I highly doubt that it will be a touchscreen. So for me, at least for now, I would still prefer Sony to keep this screen on the A7 IV and maybe put this screen on the A7S III, because that's obviously more for video shooters. Video specs is another tough one, because like I said, me being more of a stills guy rather than a video guy, I was perfectly happy with what it could shoot now, but things are and will get a lot more competitive than 2 or 3 years ago. And I know people have been asking for things like 4K 60 and 10-bit internal recording, but I'm not so hopeful on that one because they didn't do that on the A7R4 or the A9 II, so why would they do that on a much cheaper camera? If anything, they'll probably save those for the A7S III, maybe. I personally don't shoot 4K 60 or even 1080 60 for that matter, but just some nice to haves, like some 240 options would be fun to use. And it would also be nice to not have a crop on the 30 FPS modes like on the 24 FPS modes. And it's a minor thing, but I don't think anybody's a huge fan of the micro HDMI jack, so let's get something more proper in there. So in terms of my wish list, that's pretty much it really. Now, we know roughly what the R5 specs are like, but we still don't really know how much it's gonna cost. Based on the latest news, I think the R5 will cost anywhere between $3,500 to $4,000, which is, I think, pretty reasonable if they actually deliver everything they promised. And the R6, I think, will be a much closer competitor to the A7 IV, and the price of that will be somewhere in the same ballpark as the EOS R's launch price. But it's all just a speculation at this point. And we still don't really know all that much about the R6 as much as the R5. And I read that it might have a 20 megapixel sensor. It could be the same sensor that goes inside the 1DX Mark III, and it'll have IBIS and dual card slots, and it's probably not going to be as powerful as the R5 in the video department, but I'm guessing it'll have uncropped 4K at least. I mean, that sounds amazing for Canon, but this is 2020 and I'm trying to keep my expectations low because Canon doesn't exactly have the best track record for delivering their video specs. So I don't know, the A7 III, even in its current state, I think will remain pretty competitive for a while, and also with the potential discount that it will get after the A7 IV launch, I think it will remain pretty popular. But what kind of worries me with the A7 IV is that Sony has already revealed two of their flagship cameras, the A7R4 and the A9 II, and will they make the A7 IV better than them in any way? I mean, like I said, even if they just fix the grip and the card slots, I'll be a pretty happy guy. But where will Sony be a year from now or 2 years from now? Well, obviously, I think we'll know a lot more within a month or two, so we'll just have to wait and see. So let me know in the comments, are you with Team Sony or with Team Canon? Which camera are you more excited about, the Canon R5 or the R6, or the Sony A7 IV or the A7S III? That's it for me today, and thank you for watching as always, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.